Hello, Euro Squad, and welcome to part 3 of our lecture series on the Cold War. This is our final section of the Cold War, and thus also our final section of the class in Western civilization. So today we're going to start to move into the end of the Cold War, into Detente, which leads to the downfall of the Soviet influence in Eastern Europe, and then leads to the fall of things like the Berlin Wall and the end of the Soviet Union itself, disintegration of the Soviet sphere in Europe. And we see some modern changes as well, as you can see from Esquire magazine here on the cover. In the 1970s, late 1960s, we have a picture of a saucy actress doing a little shaving, a little reference to the women's rights movement, which was starting to make some headway in the late 1960s and 70s, in the United States anyway. And then we also see Richard Milhous Nixon playing ping pong with Mao Zedong and Leonid Brezhnev watching, a little reference to Pingpong Diplomacy and the Detente period. We see the issue of the United States not having enough oil because of the problems dealing with OPEC over issues facing Israel and our alliance with them. And then, of course, the modern computer, bringing us ever closer to my beautiful MacBook Pro. So, a lot of changes happening at this time. We'll start with the 1960s and the women's rights movement. Things happening at this time for the ladies. Because, just a little quick and dirty review here, I mean, femininity, or views of femininity, have changed throughout European history, and ultimately American history as well. Because during the Renaissance period, you might recall that women kind of lost some rights. The women of William the Conqueror's England in 1066 had more protection against rape and more legal protection than did women in Renaissance Venice. So, I mean, the laws of the time are not looking good for women during the Renaissance, and women are certainly being separated, at least in the upper classes, away from anything of importance. If you're a working class person, then it doesn't matter if you're male or female, you're going to be working, all right? So if you're a farmer or a peasant at this time, it's pretty equal. But otherwise, women, being pushed out of society and not recognized for their potential. The Enlightenment's going to change that ever so slightly, because there will be women who are participating in the coffee house movements. They're also leading the salons and therefore having a little bit greater intellectual stimulation. Women are also increasingly reading at this time and becoming literate and educated. Big, cool advances culturally, but ultimately, I mean, still no rights by the Industrial Revolution and the Victorian era, because even in the Victorian era in the late 19th century, we had things like the rule of thumb, which, as you may recall from our discussion previously, that a man could legally beat his wife in both England and the United States as long as the object that he used to beat her was no wider than the width of his thumb. And then in Victorian England, in order for a woman to get a divorce, even if her husband was a total jerk face, in order to get a divorce, it took an act of parliament. So I mean, women's rights up to the 20th century have not exactly been favorable. They've come in bits and pieces with things like the vote by the time we get into the World War I era, but otherwise, not favorable. Things are starting to change a little bit intellectually for women by the 1950s and 60s. I mean, one of the progenitors of this movement, the lady leaders of this movement, was Simone de Beauvoir. So Simone de Beauvoir wrote a book called The Second Sex, in which she articulated that women throughout history have basically been raised for dependency, that they have been raised to look pretty, to sound pretty, but not do much else. And honestly, I mean, if that's really what women are like in the 1940s and 50s, not much has changed again since the Renaissance, when we had Castiglione's Courtière, which said that women are meant to be decoratively educated and no more. They're meant to be good arm candy for their menfolk. All right? And so what she was hoping for was a revolution in women's rights. And her idea of revolution meant greater respect and liberation from some of the ideas, like, for instance, that a woman cannot be a mother and work in society at the same time. The idea that a woman cannot participate in politics as a leader, not just a voter. That's liberation, liberating from that kind of stuff. Other women will take that even farther and say, let's burn our bras, man! We don't need the bras, they're too confining, man! And then, you get all kinds of fun hippie stuff to go along with it. So women's liberation is an important movement. And ladies, if, you're not into the whole bra burning thing, and if you equate feminism with the less noble term feminazi, which is the idea that women who like to be respected as, feminists, there's this idea, this negative stereotype of feminists that they don't like sexual relations with men. They, are bra-burning, angry women that want to argue against men all the time and, therefore don't quite fit in as a beautiful, pretty woman. That's a negative stereotype because women who want equal rights should be every woman. All right? Any woman that wants to be educated the same, be able to speak the same, be able to have the exact same rights as a man, they should be in favor of what's called feminism. So, don't turn it into a dirty word, ladies. Feminism is not the F word. Dirty word, right? Okay. All right. So, 1968, we see some other revolutionary sentiment happening at this time because they're going to call this the year that rocked the world. All right. In the United States, that was certainly the year that rocked the world. That was also our worst year in Vietnam. We saw a lot of revolutionary sentiment coming from all kinds of angles from society. It was hardcore. Rock and roll, hardcore at this time too. But in Europe at this time, it's kind of ironic because here we have the aging Charles de Gaulle, the president of France, the 78-year-old president of France, who on New Year's Eve of 1967 was broadcasting. Hey, what's going on? Sorry, I am recording something. Hold on. No, I'm just recording a lecture for Western Civ. Let me get out of it here. Pause it. And here we have the 78-year-old president of France, Charles de Gaulle, on New Year's Eve of 1967, broadcasting his annual message to the nation. Brimming with self-satisfaction, he said, "I greet the year 1968 with serenity. It is impossible to see how France today could be paralyzed by crisis as she has been in the past." Little did he know that 6 months later, de Gaulle would be fighting for his political life, and the French capital was paralyzed after weeks of student riots, followed by a sudden general strike. Because by the spring of 1968, the campuses will revolt against nationalist France, against the policies represented by Charles de Gaulle, against imperialism, against the war in Vietnam that France wasn't even a part of anymore, but revolting against American participation in Vietnam, revolt against containment, revolt against, you name it, their parents, the man. So here's a little video about it.
Students were at like a revolutionary breaking point. I remember some poll that said 1 million college students self-described themselves as revolutionaries.
It wasn't just the United States, it was international. Students in Germany, France, Japan, Ireland, China, Mexico had all taken to the streets, demanding everything: student power, an end to the war in Vietnam, or simply more freedom.
We were hearing by 1968 in this country, over and over, we were hearing an analysis that we were a generation of spoiled kids, that we were Dr. Spock's kids, that permissive child raising, which actually I never experienced in my own life, but was the source of the movement. Well, that couldn't have been true in Germany. It was not true in Italy. Or not true in Japan. And the fact that it was international, I think, completely refutes that very simplistic psychological argument which we heard all the time.
Everything that happened overseas fueled the sense that we were on the cusp of some momentous change in the history of the world.
The Columbia strike may have reminded people of the Paris Commune, but May '68 in France was the real thing. What began as a student protest for reform of the archaic, authoritarian French university system sparked a general strike that electrified the country.
They were anarchists, most of them. That was the spirit. The slogan was all power to the imagination, that you can do anything, that we don't have to live with all the various forms of repression which we're used to. So it was anti-capitalist, but that was just part of this general, complete sort of cultural revolution that the French students were anticipating. And so it's interesting that although they were the furthest out in any way politically, that was also the one place where workers joined with students and almost toppled the government.
May 10th, the night of the barricades, 20,000 students marched in the Latin Quarter. Police and students clashed. Street fighting went on for weeks. The rioting and marches of up to 500,000 people frightened not only President de Gaulle, but the French Communist Party as well. The old left thought this new left was out of control. They had impossible dreams.
The two principal slogans, I think, were quotations from Marx and Rimbaud. From Marx, let us change the world. From Rimbaud, let us change life.
Carlos Fuentes, the Mexican novelist, was an active participant in May '68, along with many international students caught up in the excitement.
What there was is a sense of extraordinary brotherhood and sisterhood. There was this capacity to embrace people in the streets. There were couples kissing. There were couples that fell apart because they did not share political views. Paris was divided by the River Seine as never before. On the left bank, you had the left, the revolutionaries, the dreamers. On the right side, you had the conservatives, you had the Gaullists, you had the financiers, the money people, the bourgeoisie. So the city was divided as much as in Les Misérables in Victor Hugo or in any of the great occasions of this city that seems to need a great revolutionary explosion from time to time.
Eventually, the May uprising subsided. The powerful trade unions controlled by the communists refused to take part, and police kept up relentless pressure. But over time, the students did succeed in reforming and modernizing the French educational system, and they rejuvenated the Socialist Party, which a decade later became the elected government of France.
The spring of 1968, one brick thrown in Paris and its crash was heard around the world. In Berlin, Prague, Chicago, Rome, Mexico City, and even London, protesters are taking to the streets. And so all of this beginning because of that liberal mentality that was prevalent in the post-war years amongst that new generation of people that considered themselves the new left. So the new left is unlike the old left. The old left represents old-style communism, the idea that we can change the world through political and socialistic kinds of combinations within the government. Guys that are opposed to de Gaulle politically, but these kids are just all over the place, man. Some of them were extremely liberal. Some of them wanted just revolutions against rigidity. All right, so whatever that means. They wanted revolution against bourgeois mentality, against authoritarianism, which they saw President de Gaulle as one of those authoritarian leaders. They wanted a revolution against American involvement in Vietnam and other sections of the world where decolonization was starting to happen. They said, let those people go. So the idea was they had slogans like, everyone to the barricades, and all power to the imagination. Whatever that may entail, man, because we've got also the common spirit of the youthful rebellion. I mean, you got kids out in the street, teenagers and college students in the streets, and it's cool to protest the government and throw bricks at cops, man, and overturn cars and free love, man. It's exciting. All right, so, it gets a little radical, though. The radical left is a little too radical. The Popular Front, as they were also called, these Marxist students, were a little too radical here for even the old left. And so they alienated many of the older generation of communists that were out there, but also started to displease, certainly, anyone that's in the government at this point. They're going to find a way to start cracking down, and the revolution will lose its steam with little changes other than to the educational system and some minor changes to the government. But the fact is, we're seeing some change. Meanwhile, the Cold War is going to cool across the world at this point because that competition and indirect conflict of things like the Korean and Vietnam conflicts, also we had Sputnik and the space race. These things are starting to bankrupt the government. So Sputnik, for instance, once the Soviets are going to launch Sputnik in the mid-1950s, it will not only provoke the space race, which is incredibly expensive, as Kennedy dares us to go to the moon by the end of the decade, but also it's going to prove to Americans we're stupid. So they start to think, hey, if the commies are sending up all these satellites into space, why aren't we? And so, part of the reason that math and science became so heavily emphasized in the 1950s was because of the desire to keep up or even surpass the commies. All right, part of the reason that we have standardized testing today is to be able to prove that America is getting smarter and that we are better than other countries at taking tests and proving our knowledge. So thank you, commies, for giving us the SATs, ACTs, AP European History exam, you name it. Thanks a lot. All right, we also have the arms race. All right, so you saw in a previous lecture that the Soviets are going to build Tsar Bomba, which is going to cost them astronomical sums of money, and so the Americans are developing similar weapons, not as large, but certainly a lot of them, and it's costing a ton of money, and nobody can really afford it that well. The Americans can afford it a little better than the Soviets, however. Meanwhile, Korea and Vietnam are going to end up bankrupting the United States. I mean, bringing us to the verge of bankruptcy anyway, because of some of the commitments there, and the involvement will not only monetarily cost a lot of money, but bankrupt the American population because people will become increasingly distrustful of their government. So as they're being told they're fighting to contain communism, many are starting to wonder, for what purpose are we fighting to contain communism? I mean, Vietnam by 1968, there was 50%, at least 50% of the population of America that was polled that was opposed to the Vietnam conflict. And so this is starting to cost both money and consequences for the government's ability to run the countries, both the United States and the USSR. So Detente is going to be this period of easing of Cold War tensions that we're going to see happening, primarily because the USSR and China, they used to be allies, they used to be buddies, but there's going to be a divorce because Khrushchev is going to step on the toes of Mao, and Mao is going to step on the toes of Khrushchev. Then Brezhnev is going to hate Mao even more. Mao saw the USSR as committing cultural superiority arguments against China. And so they're going to increasingly separate and start to buddy up to the ultimate anti-commie of the 50s, Mr. Richard Milhous Nixon, who by 1968 is going to get elected into as the President of the United States, as the Republican candidate. He said he's going to be tough on commies, but now he's starting to buddy up to the commies because it makes more sense, right? The U.S. wanted out of Vietnam, so he's going to work to start to bring us out of Vietnam, and then meanwhile start to buddy up to Mao Zedong, who was supporting much of the North Vietnamese cause and some of the expansion into Cambodia. So what Nixon wants to do is buddy up to the commies. All right, this is going to turn into a little thing called Pingpong Diplomacy, because if there's one thing the Chinese like, it's ping pong. So the ping pong, international ping pong tournament, is going to be taking place at this time in the early 1970s. And at one point, the American ping pong team is going to end up on the wrong bus. So it's a beautiful moment because the Chinese government had told their ping pong players, do not trust the West, do not trust the Western powers, especially America. You cannot talk to those players because they are going to try and bring you into capitalism and whatever other fear they could incite into their team. So at one point, one of the American players, a 19-year-old player from California, is going to accidentally get on the Chinese bus, and there's going to be this awkward moment where the Chinese are going to look at him and he's going to look at them, and it's going to be like, uh-oh, is this going to be a war? But instead he sat down. He sat down, he hung out, he talked to them, and then eventually he starts playing with them, and they start teaching him things, and he teaches them things, and then eventually this American player will talk to basically what was the Prime Minister of China, the second-hand man to Mao Zedong, a guy by the name of Zhou Enlai. He's going to talk to Zhou Enlai, and he was a bit of a hippie. It's not the guy that's pictured here. He's a guy that had longer hair, and he's talking to Zhou and like, yo, I'm a part of the hippie movement, and I like hippies, and I'm just playing ping pong because it's so fun, man, and I want to see the world, man. And Zhou Enlai at one point actually called the kid's mother, who was quite worried about her son for being a hippie and being opposed to things like Vietnam and experimenting with drugs. And so Zhou Enlai called this kid's mother and said, hey, don't worry, he's the youth, and the youth will experiment, the youth will do things that we may not agree with, but they eventually come back. So that's kind of cool, that's kind of cool. Zhou Enlai. Next, we're going to see that the Soviets are going to try and get some grain, and they got to get it from the United States of America, which is a bit ironic given that they are communists, and they're going to have to purchase it on American credit. I mean, this is the ultimate sign that the Soviets just can't seem to keep up with the economy and with providing for their people, and they know it. So Leonid Brezhnev is increasingly going to start talking to, at this point, it's Gerald Ford, our president, who's going to take over for Tricky Dick, and so at this point, tensions are easing. We're starting to talk. We're starting to see some good signs of development. Meanwhile, the Chancellor of the Federal Republic of Germany, the West German Chancellor, Willy Brandt, is going to have a beautiful moment where, despite what his Western allies told him, NATO didn't want him to do this, but he's going to go over to the East and extend a little policy that he calls Ostpolitik, which was his way of saying we need to improve relations with the East, with our East German brothers, with Poland, and with the USSR and Leonid Brezhnev. So Willy Brandt's actually going to go, and in a dramatic moment, he's going to go to the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising Memorial in Warsaw, and he'll have a moment of silence. He'll kneel at the Ghetto Uprising Monument and offer a moment of silence and his condolences to the crimes that were committed by Germans against the Poles. So Detente, we can say, is a beautiful moment because this is the first step to the end of the Cold War and the end of the Soviet domination of Eastern Europe, which will come in 1989. All right, meanwhile, the social response that we're going to see, we have a book that's going to be published by Alexander Solzhenitsyn, who was a person who was convicted of being against Stalin during the Stalinist era, and he will spend time in the Gulag. So in a Gulag in Siberia, he's going to be inspired to write a couple of different books, one of which was the Gulag Archipelago, another one was A Day in the Life of Denis Ivanovich, and from writing these books, he's going to have to actually publish them anonymously by smuggling them out of the USSR in the early 1970s to publishers in the West who will publish it for him. Now, once they publish that, it will be exposed who the author was, and the Nobel Peace Prize will be given to Alexander Solzhenitsyn. The problem? He can't receive it unless he decides to abandon his Soviet citizenship and leave the Soviet Union, which he will do in the 1970s. He'll go and live in the West, live in the United States. He actually won't enjoy the United States. He won't enjoy the pop culture of the 1980s, which he saw as depraved. And so once the Cold War is over in 1991, he's actually going to go back to Russia and have his his Russian citizenship restored. So it's kind of a cool sign that, you know what, things are changing. People want to hear these stories about how awful it is in the Gulag. But the question is, can the Soviet Union continue to hold on despite all of this opposition around the globe? Well, apparently not very well, because economic difficulties are going to start to bring down the Soviet government. All right, so first of all, there's the agricultural crisis of 1972 to 75, where they couldn't get enough grain, so therefore they had to buy it on credit from the American government. We also have the arms race, which is a definite sign that the USSR is trying everything it can do to keep up with the Americans in the arms race. So they have what you would call a quantitative lead, meaning they had as many guns, if not more. They had as many ships, as many submarines, as many, you name it. They had a lot of stuff, but the problem is qualitatively they were falling behind. So while the Soviets might have a nuclear arsenal that surpassed that of the United States, they didn't have as good of nukes. I mean, the nukes that the Americans had by 1980 were pretty incredible. We had nukes in the 80s where you could fire an intercontinental ballistic missile from, for instance, Great Falls, Montana, from a nuclear silo below ground, and that would fly across the Pacific, and within that nuclear warhead there would be 9 different nuclear warheads that would fire once it exited out of the atmosphere. It would start to re-enter the atmosphere and then break into multiple nuclear warheads that would be able to hit different cities, like, for instance, 8 or 9 different cities. I mean, that's intense, and that's what the Americans have. The Soviets just don't have anything quite like that at the moment. All right, and so the issue for the Soviet Union by the 1970s and 80s is that they simply can't provide for both guns and butter. They can't do both. It's too hard for them. All right, meanwhile, they're going to decide to invade Afghanistan in 1979. Huge mistake, because Afghanistan, you know, we've learned this lesson, and certainly the Brits learned it earlier in the 19th century and the 20th century, and now the Soviets are learning it in 1979, that Afghanistan is the graveyard of empires. All right, so the Soviets invaded Afghanistan, had a hard time because the United States was providing guns and anti-tank and anti-helicopter weapons to the Mujahideen of Afghanistan, who will later, of course, become Al-Qaeda. And so they're fighting a losing war here, fighting an absolute losing war. A lot of bodies coming home from Afghanistan. The Soviets are asking why. Why is this happening? Well, they did this initially to support the Communist Party of Afghanistan, and then it turned into an actual occupation, and they couldn't afford it anymore. I mean, there are authors that have said that the reason that the Soviet Union fell, the reason that the Berlin Wall fell, it was not because, Reagan said, Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall in 1987. That's not why the wall fell or why the Soviet Union fell. It's because they couldn't afford their third world commitments anymore, such as Afghanistan and other places around around the globe couldn't afford it anymore. It was costing too much money. And so even though, the United States is doing the same thing, we are paying billions for things like the Star Wars program, which was meant to be a nuclear deterrent, where if the Soviet Union fired a nuke, we'd be able to find it in the atmosphere and then shoot it basically with lasers before they got a chance to re-enter the atmosphere and kill America, which was brilliant. But we could afford that, and afford commitments in Central America, and afford commitments all over the globe, and still provide the bare more than the bare necessities that Americans wanted, because we are American, we are capitalist. The Soviet Union simply could not do that. And so Mikhail Gorbachev is going to come in 1985, and he's going to gamble here, because his goal is to save the Soviet Union. His goal is to save the Soviet Union through bureaucratic reforms. He knows it's necessary. Similar to Khrushchev during the Khrushchev thaw, he wants to save communism, not destroy it. And so what he's going to do is bring in some changes. He's going to bring in perestroika, which is economic and political restructuring, meaning that the single-party system where politicians are saying how the economy should be run may not be the best solution. Instead, we should start to bring in some changes that will liberalize the economy to make it more effective and more efficient. Glasnost is going to be intellectual openness, meaning greater freedoms of speech, greater ability to choose your leaders in Eastern Europe, and so less rigidity and authoritarianism from the government. The problem is that the USSR is a party-run economy command, command economy, excuse me. So what that means, the problem is that the USSR is a party-run command economy. And what that means is that they will not be able to efficiently come up with the right kind of products, because what they're doing is they're saying, we want to meet this much demand. We want to have this many nails, for instance. That doesn't mean we want quality nails. We want this many nails, all right? Or we want this many tanks. Doesn't mean we want the highest quality, or this many TVs. Not the highest quality, but at least we have that many. All right, so the problem is that the regime just simply can't handle it, and they can't handle openness in an information age where color television and mass media is going to spread across the globe. I mean, the radio waves and the television waves will show communism is failing, and people will see it, and they will want change. So in the 1960s, in 1968, we heard about the Brezhnev Doctrine, which said that the Soviet Union would intervene anywhere that communism lay in jeopardy to falling to capitalism, and that is now obsolete. Now we're going to get what people will nickname the Sinatra Doctrine, after Gorbachev, who said that he's going to let everybody do things their way. He's going to allow Eastern Europe, for instance, to do it their way. Similar to Sinatra, who said, I did it my way, right? All right, so he'll be Man of the Year in the 1980s here. 1988 is when they will call him Man of the Year. They'll also call him the birthmark that changed the world. Because, man, he's got a big birthmark on his head, and he's bald, so that doesn't help him. So, the birthmark that changed the world is going to lead to the downfall of communism in Eastern Europe. We call it the miracles of 1989, because it all happened in a 12-month period. Well, the effects lasted a little longer, but it all essentially is happening in a 12-month period, and almost bloodlessly. Almost bloodlessly. All right? In Poland is where it's going to begin. Next, we're going to see it happening in Hungary. Then it's going to happen in East Germany. Then in the Czech Republic. Finally in Bulgaria and Romania. But in Bulgaria, things are going to get tense. In Romania, it'll get bloody. The end of the Eastern Empire, the end of Soviet domination of Eastern Europe is going to happen because Eastern Europe is starting to seek a socialism that is selling out. They want some of the benefits of socialism, but what they're really asking for here is capitalism and freedom. And so Gorbachev, since he said, I'm going to let them do it their way, he's going to let them go. All right, so it's going to begin in Poland with Lech Walesa. What he wants to see is changes within the government that favors both the workers and advocates for democracy. It's a beautiful ideal. Another thing he wants to emphasize is Catholicism, the return of Catholicism, because during the time of the Soviet Union, they were essentially an atheistic state, even in Poland, which was highly Catholic before this time. And so now Lech Walesa wants to return to those ideals. All right, so that's going to be successful, and the Soviet Union will not intervene militarily, therefore showing the rest of Eastern Europe it can be done. So that leads us to German unification, which is going to happen in spite of the dangers of the Berlin Wall. Let's take a look.
Gorbachev, tear down this wall.
So you saw that despite the dangers of the Berlin Wall, German unification is going to happen. Now it's going to happen because East Germans, they're going to flee for Hungary and start to flood into Hungary. Many of these are the young and the educated. And Hungary is going to keep their border open and even have trains coming from West Germany through Hungary in order to get those people from East Germany over to West Germany. Now, the reason they have to do this is because they have to avoid the checkpoints and the wall that's separating West Berlin and separating freedom from the tyranny of East Germany and East Berlin. And so at one point, the newsman. So at one point, the public relations man for East Berlin is going to go on the national media, on the news, and he's going to basically say that at some point in the near future, relations will be opened between East and West, and that travel restrictions will be lifted between East and West, meaning that people will be able to go between East Berlin and West Berlin freely. He says at some point. And so all of a sudden, the newsmen in the room perk up. I mean, initially this was just going to be your average news conference, but all of a sudden they perk up and say, wait a second, at what point is that going to happen? And the guy hadn't really read the document very well. He didn't know when that was supposed to happen. It wasn't supposed to happen for a couple of months here. But he starts to read it and he goes, immediately. Because he didn't know. And so immediately everybody's flooding out to the streets. Tom Brokaw is going to go out to the streets and he's going to report live and say, look what's happening. And now we've got openness. People will storm the wall. They'll take down the wall. And Chancellor Helmut Kohl is going to be the man, myth and legend, that will help this all to happen. Chancellor Helmut Kohl was the leader of West Germany, and he will say, let this happen as the people charge the wall. No one will intervene to stop them, and Gorbachev will not intervene to stop them either. So the hero here, Helmut Kohl and Gorbachev, they will allow it to happen. The wall will fall, and Helmut Kohl is going to put aside fears that many people had at this time, including our own president at the time, George H.W. Bush, who was a little fearful that a rejuvenated Germany could turn into a problem for Europe, and France was certainly fearful of a revived and reunified Germany. But Helmut Kohl is going to promise them, look, we're going to join the West, we're going to join the European community, the EU, and we're going to participate in NATO, but we don't want to tick off Gorbachev either. Let's do this slowly and carefully. So over the next 6 months, he's going to find ways to make sure that this happens without alienating either Gorbachev in the East or the Western powers of France, Great Britain, the United States in the West. Meanwhile, in Czechoslovakia, just a month later, Václav Havel is going to bring in the Velvet Revolution. Václav Havel was a poet from Czechoslovakia. He'll be elected as the new president of Czechoslovakia, and slowly but surely he's going to remove socialism and start to integrate Czechoslovakia back into the capitalist world, back into the European Union. All right, and then Bulgaria and Romania, they're going to do their thing as well, but Romania, violence will erupt. The president, the communist president leader of Romania, is going to get shot, as will many of his leaders that were working with him here. And so Romania is going to get ugly. The reasons for all of this, the reason that all of this is going to happen so quickly, these miracles of 1989, are because, first of all, you've got economic failure, which bred resentment. Over the course of the entire Cold War, all of this economic failure meant that people were sick of standing in line for toilet paper. And thanks to the information age, they're seeing it. They're seeing the difference between capitalism and communism. They see the colored televisions and the information that is freely spread, the freedom that is desired over in the East is so easily acquired over in the West. And the information age shows us that. Plus we have international youth culture. which is also showing us a lot of resentment. We're hearing bands like the Ramones that are saying, yo, it's time to protest here. It's time to get involved in the world and screw authoritarianism, man. And so the Ramones, they're spreading the message. The international youth culture is prevalent, and globalization is spreading this message in a way that the communists just can't handle. Meanwhile, the Kremlin back in the USSR is crumbling at this point too. The collapse of the USSR is going to come because Gorbachev will take an authoritarian turn by 1989. He's starting to see that once he loses his grip on Eastern Europe, he's worried he's going to lose his grip over the entire rest of the Soviet Union. Economically, politically, really can't afford that. So even though he's got the policies of perestroika and glasnost, he's not going to be living up to those claims anymore, because he's going to start to listen to the militarists and the authoritarians within the Communist Party that say it's time to start bringing down the iron fist again. They're advocating for an iron fist with a velvet glove. Well, Boris Yeltsin doesn't exactly like that. Boris Yeltsin is the hard-drinking mayor and communist of Moscow. So even though he's a communist, he starts to realize that this system is no longer going to work, and so he's becoming increasingly more of a Democrat who's leaning toward the market economy. So what he's going to do is he will be at least vaguely a part of what we see happening in the August coup. Now, the August coup was not inspired by Yeltsin, but he will become a prime figure in this thing because the militarists are going to try and take over the government in August of 1991. You see, Mikhail Gorbachev was told, hey, why don't you go on vacation for a little bit? And Gorbachev's like, yeah, man, it's been a tough couple of years. I guess I'll go hang out and just relax for a little while. Well, the militarists are going to take that opportunity in order to put him under house arrest. So they're going to put Gorbachev under house arrest and then try and take over the party government and reestablish a strong authoritarian communism, kind of like a re-Stalinization that we saw under Brezhnev back in the 1960s. They want to do the same thing here in 1991. Well, thankfully, Yeltsin is going to use the power of the media. He's going to take this thing by storm. He's going to lead the people and say we need to keep the reforms. So Yeltsin will, maybe a little drunkenly crawl up on this tank here, and in a beautiful moment, the cameras will be rolling and see as the people say no to the tanks. We want something different.
So now with the end of the August coup, from August until December of 1991, the big question is, what do we do with this union of Soviet Socialist republics? Well, they'll put it to a vote in December of 1991, and then on December the 25th, 1991, the Soviet hammer and sickle flag will be lowered for the last time over the Kremlin in Moscow, because they will vote to dissolve the Soviet Union. Thereafter, it will be replaced by the Russian tricolor. And earlier in the day, Mikhail Gorbachev resigned his post as president of the Soviet Union, leaving Boris Yeltsin as president of the newly independent Russian state, free from communism. Oh, the end of an era. All right, and so some historians like John Lukács have argued that the end of the Soviet domination and the end of communism in Russia and the start of a new Russia is the end of the century. Essentially, it was a short century, as he said, because thus ended the conflict of the 20th century, and now we move into an era that's entirely different. He argues that the 21st century begins in 1991 with the end of the Soviet Union, because now the only superpower left is the United States, and ever since then, some of the big problems that have been happening with the United States and some of their issues. But let's not leave out Eastern Europe, because in Yugoslavia, tensions erupted in 1990 after Serbia's president, a guy by the name of Slobodan Milosevic, all right, he's going to take over for Tito. So Marshal Tito is going to die. And this is going to usher in the Yugoslav Wars, because Slobodan Milosevic began to promote control of the entire Yugoslav Federation by ethnic Serbs as a replacement for communism. Other ethnic groups in Yugoslavia, such as Bosnians and Muslims, resisted Milosevic's militant pro-Serb nationalism and called for secession. Now, some of these independent states will secede in the summer of 1991, such as the two republics of Slovenia and Croatia. They will successfully secede, but the Yugoslav army, which was eager to enforce Serbian supremacy, will invade. Now, a devastating civil war is going to break out in Bosnia-Herzegovina when the republic's Muslim majority tried to create a multicultural and multi-ethnic state. With the covert military support of Milosevic's government, though, the Bosnian Serb men who were in the area formed a guerrilla army and gained the upper hand by massacring civilians, rounding them up, putting them into concentration camps, and starving them to death. Relentless violence in the Balkans was inflicted on neighbors in the name of creating ethnically pure states in a region where ethnic mixture, not ethnic purity, was the norm. During the 1990s, civilians died by the tens of thousands as Serbs, under Milosevic's leadership, pursued a policy they called ethnic cleansing, and otherwise genocide, against the non-Serb ethnicities. Serb men raped women to leave them pregnant with Serb babies as another form of conquest, hoping that that would destroy the ethnically impure non-Serb population. In 1995, though, Croatian forces murdered Serbs who had helped seize land from Croatia. That same year, the Serbs retaliated by slaughtering 8,000 Muslim boys and men in the towns of Srebrenica. And the order from their commander of the Serb forces was, kill the lot. So this is the situation in the post-war world, in the post-Cold War world, where now that the two superpowers are no longer competing, the question is, what do we do about this? So the United States is going to intervene in the Kosovo conflict, trying to prevent some of this ethnic conflict that was taking place in Albania, a former Yugoslav neighbor. And so now what they're going to try and do is be the single superpower that's helping out, and can't always do so effectively. I mean, the United Nations will assist in these Yugoslav wars, but the question is, exactly how far can that go? Because not only are we dealing with ethnic cleansing and civil war in Eastern Europe, but we're dealing now with global terror. Now, in the Cold War world, there's all kinds of opportunities for global terrorism to spread because of the covert operations that both the United States and the Soviet Union were trying to get going against each other. They were employing other radicals and revolutionaries to do their fighting for them by giving them guns, giving them money, giving them training in things like military operations. So between 1945 and 2001, there were over 10,000 different individual acts of terrorism that were perpetrated across the globe, not all of which against the United States, of course, one of which was in Munich. So in Munich, at the Olympic Games in 1972, we have Israelis that are the Israeli Olympic track team that's going to be kidnapped by Palestinian PLO, so the Palestinian Liberation Army, basically, who's going to take over, and they're going to take these guys and kidnap them, put them on a helicopter, try and hold them hostage for ransom, for such as, gaining greater freedoms against Israel here for the Palestinians. And it's going to be bloody. I mean, at one point, a grenade's going to be thrown into a helicopter with some of the captives from Israel, and it's going to be blown to pieces, and those men will be killed. So, that's one ugly instance of non-Al-Qaeda related terror that's going to take place in the post-war world because, this is essentially how the Cold War is often fought, unfortunately. We train subversives, they use their skills in their own revolutionary methods. We also see that in Afghanistan, all right, because in Afghanistan, Ronald Reagan and the United States is going to meet with the future members of the Taliban. Those guys are called the Mujahideen. And at one point, we have Ronald Reagan making, a comment saying these gentlemen are the moral equivalents of America's founding fathers, which I think later he'll, regret because the Mujahideen we were using to fight against the communists and the Russians that had invaded into Afghanistan. So we gave them guns, we gave them anti-aircraft missiles, we gave them anti-tank bazookas. The goal is for them to do the fighting for us, and we funded their military strength. And one of those revolutionary fighters in the Mujahideen was none other than Osama bin Laden. So, that's going to come back to bite us, unfortunately. That training and military mentality will come back to bite us in 9/11, certainly, which, of course, is not our fault in any way, nor is it Reagan's fault, and there's no way to predict that this could have ever happened. But that's just the unfortunate side of the Cold War, is how the training and the weapons and the money that's going around often come back to bite us. All right, the same kind of stuff is going to happen with the Soviet Union, just not to nearly the same extent, of course, as 9/11. Now, some historians have suggested that that 9/11 is tantamount to the attack on Pearl Harbor, which started World War II, because 9/11 essentially has started World War III. This World War III is definitely a global war against terror, and it seems to be an unending war, because rather than declaring war on a nation, we're declaring war on a noun, terrorism, which you can't really defeat it. Honestly, you cannot. And so here is an example of the effect that's going to happen on Europe, since we are talking about Europe here and not necessarily just the United States. Here is a little video talking about how terror post 9/11 is going to affect Europe.
Terrorists planted 13 backpacks and gym bags stuffed with explosives in commuter trains entering 3 crowded stations. Detonators were wired to cell phones, and when they rang, the bombs went off. 197 people were killed, and more than 1,500 were injured. The Spanish government had at first blamed Basque separatists for the attacks, but it quickly became clear that responsibility belonged to a group claiming to be the representatives of Al-Qaeda in Europe, called Ansar al-Qaeda, or Partisans of Al-Qaeda. Ansar al-Qaeda was led by educated middle-class Muslim radicals who got their financial support in large part from ordinary criminals.
The Spaniards have now discovered that some of the explosives used in the Madrid attack were purchased with drug money.
One of the chief suspects in the bombings, a Tunisian businessman, enlisted a young Moroccan to smuggle hashish into Spain. The profits were used to buy guns and explosives. As Spain grieved its loss, the motive behind the bombings remained unclear, but the results were obvious. National elections held 4 days after the bombings led to the defeat of Spain's pro-American government and Spain's withdrawal of troops from Iraq. It's a success that surely bolstered terrorists around the world.
16 months after the Madrid bombings, Al-Qaeda strikes again, this time in London. Experts agree the July 7th London blasts have all the trademarks of Al-Qaeda. Like Madrid, the coordinated attack on the city's crowded transit system during rush hour was an attempt to wreak maximum chaos during a high-profile political event. The attack in London hit as the G8 summit opened in Scotland. Flanked by leaders of the world's largest industrial nations, British Prime Minister Tony Blair condemned the bombings.
We condemn utterly these barbaric attacks. We send our profound condolences to the victims and their families. Today's bombings will not weaken in any way our resolve to uphold the most deeply held principles of our societies and to defeat those who would impose their fanaticism and extremism on all of us.
The world leaders demonstrated a show of unity in the face of extremism. But the war on terror is not yet won.
We should always remember that they are ahead of us. They know what they're going to do. They are in a new path already. And that's the game we are playing.
It's a frightening scenario, one that poses a major and continuing challenge to the United States and its allies.
So the absolutely ugly effects of terrorism in the post-Cold War world we can see will have dramatic impact on our modern world today and where we go from here. So the question is, where do we go from here? Here we have a historian by the name of Samuel P. Huntington. He is, or was a professor. He died in 2008, but he was a professor, very conservative thinker and writer, and he sees all of this this conflict between the Muslim world that's going on today with terrorism and ISIL and all of the conflict in the Middle East, and then our response to it as a clash of civilizations. So he gave us an important treatise in which he said that this is a clash of civilizations that's essentially unwinnable. All right, and the United States policy maybe should not, it should maybe rethink its policy, as should Europe rethink its policy on the issues of global terror. The question is, what do we do about it? Well, he says that the Muslim wars have replaced the Cold War as the principal form of international conflict. The makings of a general clash of civilizations exist. The longer and the more intensely the United States and its allies use military force against their opponents, the more widespread and intense will be the Muslim reaction. September 11th produced Western unity. A prolonged response to September 11th could produce Muslim unity. Now, I have to agree, after the two wars that have been fought in Iraq and Afghanistan, after all of the conflict that's been going on in Europe and in the United States, and now in the Middle East with ISIL, the question is, what do we do? That remains to be seen, and it's up to you, as educated young adults, to fix our broken world. Thanks for watching.